0 participants.
Oh, see, we already have a couple. We'll just wait for a few minutes or a minute or so as people join. Welcome to Rainbow Space Magic. Okay, why don't we get going? So this is a session of readings. Before our panelists introduce themselves, I just want to go over a few logistics. My name is Monique, and I'm part of the RSM team, and I'm actually going to be doing a reading session as well. So you're welcome to use the chat to talk to each other and share recommendations and such in a respectful manner. If you would like to submit a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. There will be time for questions closer to the end of the session, hopefully, but feel free to send those questions in anytime that you think of them. And then afterwards, the conversation can continue on the Discord channel for readings if you're interested. So without further ado, let's get going. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to be doing the first reading.
Hi, my name is Mark Salzwedel, and I'm a science fiction and fantasy author. My first novel is what I'm going to be reading from. Came out in 2022, The Lever. It's a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender market sci-fi thriller. I also have another novel that came out in April of this year. It's an urban fantasy called The Miraculous Life of Rupert Rocket. And you can find more about my writing and my blog link at marksalzwedel.com. So I'm going to be reading from the novel The Lever. It's actually chapter 20. And this takes place in the future when we've completely colonized the moon, and we've started to colonize Mars. And the lead character, Shonda Kinney, is a lesbian journalist who is following up on some people who have disappeared, who used to be genetic treatment patients. So we'll pick it up with her story. She considered surveilling a small grocery and dry goods store. She cased an equipment rental shop where she decided it would be hard to be inconspicuous. And she thought about finding a place to spy on the entrance to what had to be a bordello. She decided to check out more options and turned the corner to a more circular tube that was open through the tube wall on one side and bore a sign reading Planitia View. There she passed by an electronics vendor, a map maker's office, and a pay terminal booth one had to stand to use. The vehicle rental showroom at the end of Planitia View was a possibility, but the problem there too was that lurkers would stand out. As she headed back toward Olympus Road, she looked up into the second and third story windows, wondering if she could talk or buy her way into a lookout seat at somebody's window. Her suitcase requested to power down to conserve energy, and Shonda agreed to pull it along manually. The gravity on Mars was almost as insubstantial as on the moon, so she didn't mind the exertion, but it reminded her she needed to get off the streets as soon as possible. That no one had stopped her yet didn't mean no one was looking for her there on Mars. She turned back onto Olympus Road and kept looking there and on the side streets. After 2 blocks further, she noticed a flashing red and blue neon sign on a side tube named Melvin's Way. The flashing sign itself said Melvin's. She wondered if Melvin was a particularly wealthy entrepreneur in Marineris West. She pulled her suitcase in the direction the flashing arrow indicated. When she walked through the open doorway, Melvin struck Shonda as a particularly seedy bar with a junkyard motif. She sat on a bar stool made out of a sewage conduit and a dusty pink pillow. With one foot up on her suitcase, she asked the bartender, "What have you got that doesn't have dust on it?" The bartender, a thin man with a receding hairline and a bushy brown beard, just chuckled. "You look like you're more of a wine drinker," he said in a voice as scratchy as steel wool. He set an empty wine glass down in front of her, bent down to examine it, took a towel and wiped a film of dust off the inside and outside of the goblet, stepped back and winked at Shonda. Good guess, Shonda responded. Do you have a Chardonnay, Sauvignon, or Riesling that was bottled before I left Earth? The bartender grinned and held up one finger. Even if you left Earth 6 months ago, he joked. He ducked back down beneath the counter, an exhaust manifold covered with a plastic plank to make it flat, and popped back up with a clear plastic bottle filled with a pale golden liquid. Will you be drinking it here? He teased further. I like you, Shonda said while pointing at him. She gestured with the same finger for him to fill her glass. When he did, she continued, What's your name, sweetness? Talbot, the bearded man said without taking his attention from his pouring. Not Melvin, then, Shonda commented. No, ma'am. He uncorked the bottle and stowed it under the counter again. He won't be back in town for 2 more days. Busy guy, and he must have a lot of money. I keep seeing things named after him. The original Melvin was one of the first prospectors here, and you used to have to wear a spacesuit to get to his bar. Shonda pivoted on her dusty pink pillow with her wineglass in hand and gazed at the rest of the bar. No 2 pieces of furniture were alike. An end tabletop made of computer monitors, a chair taken from an ATV and mounted on a ComSat drone. One wall hung with cartoons spray painted onto a shower curtain. When does this place get busy? At night, the bartender said. He tried to wipe down the bar with his rag. How can you tell it's night? You won't see the sun reflecting off either canyon rim anymore, he clarified. That's when a lot of the day trips return. The wine didn't taste very good, so she set her half-full glass down on the counter and grabbed the handle of her suitcase when she stood up. I'll come back then. That's from The Leper.
Yay! Ashley is next.
Okay, I'm going to be reading from my book that just came out in February, which is Empty Cargo. Sorry, I didn't mean to blur it. It came out and it is a vampire horror based on Renfield instead of Dracula. I'm not going to be reading from the beginning. I'm going to be reading one of my favorite scenes that happens almost towards the end of the book, just because the interaction between Renfield and Dracula to me says a lot about their character. This ale tasted horrendous. Spitting it back onto the floor didn't spare him. Metallic and sour, the remaining taste lingered on his tongue, coating the inside of the sailor's mouth. The ale straight from the cask was fine. Tilting his head, Renfield swiped his right palm into the spill, watching the edge of the stain lift into the liquid. I'm drinking blood. How queer. Such a vile substance blended into the drink, splashing around the crew quarter. Renfield turned his head away, spying a tin cup sitting across him on the starboard side of the quarter. He couldn't stomach this concoction. Yet, maybe there was someone on board the Demeter who could. Gripping the cup and shaking hands, Renfield lowered the tin into the puddle, illuminated by the dying wick of the lantern carelessly placed on the trunk. All traces of foam had disappeared, leaving the now darker brown ale uncovered. Would Master drink this? Maybe it's suspicious with no head, Renfield whispered, unsure of his next action. Placing the cup under the tap, he filled the last portion under the rim with pure ale, being careful with his creation. Should he clasp the cup to him or hold it as far as he could? Renfield couldn't decide. He would never admit out loud how quietly he tiptoed into the hold, tentatively placing the cup on the floor. Renfield knocked on the closed lid once, running to conceal himself by the rickety stairs. The deckhand peeked from the railing, waiting to see if he would be ignored, or if his gift was accepted. The creaking noise of the lid was loud, chasing all of the rats out of the hole at once. Scurrying feet up the steps, Renfield split his attention between the fleeing animals and the crate. Dracula sat upright in the crate, letting the rats make their escape. Sniffing, the Count looked down at the tin cup. Sweeping the cup from the deck with one hand, Renfield ducked down to avoid the object's projected path. Count Dracula's withered hand kept hold of the tin cup. Sliding the ale down his throat in one long gulp, the cup was released. In slow motion, the empty container dropped, rattling Renfield's senses. Dracula turned his head. The taunt flesh of the man's face, partly obscured by the hard, thin, white strands of hair, stood out from the lantern lit in the quarter above, shining through the planks. Renfield. I should have followed the rats. Renfield scolded himself internally, standing but not moving from his protective corner. Come here. Count Dracula beckoned. His feet obeyed the command against Renfield's instincts. Bowing on one knee before the crate, he waited for the aristocrat's command. That was delicious. What was it, Renfield? Ale, master, Renfield whispered, keeping his eyes focused on the crate. Dracula looked at Renfield's stiffened body, dropping the cup in front of the servant. Renfield left the cup where it lay, focusing on the prominent wrinkles on the back of the passenger's hand. Get me another. The command didn't surprise Renfield. After all he had witnessed, this was the least questionable of his master's requests. Keeping his tongue silent, Renfield gripped the handle of the cup. Shuffling backwards, he didn't raise his head until the heels of his feet contacted the bottom stairs. Turning his back to Dracula, the sailor watched for any slight movement from the other. The soft flickering glow permeating the crew quarter flared, burning Renfield's eyes while he marched back to the cask. All right. And I'm done.
I feel like in some ways we're doing a dramatic transition from Dracula into fantasy, but also amused because mine also starts with ale being drunk. So not that. So I'm Kale Noone, or Kristen, which I think is what's showing up in here. I published with JMS Books, although before that I was with Less Than Three Press and Nolora's Cave way back when. Lots of queer romance, usually in various flavors of fantasy, everything from contemporary paranormal, sometimes with rock stars and demons, to very high fantasy, to alternate universe, 18th century Regency. We've been having fun with bar and drinking excerpts. Perhaps it's friendly. Let's see, what else? I think that's all the exciting things. See, a couple of years ago, I was a Good Sex Awards runner-up for the sexiest consent category for the scene that I like to describe to people as the best sex scene I've ever written, in which nobody actually touches anybody else, and there's an extended metaphor about tea. But that is not the bit that we're reading today. Sadly, that book is not actually fantasy. We are doing something from Apprentice's Luck, which was actually a prequel novel to one of my own favorite novels, Magician. This time we're going back in time a little bit, and it is high fantasy, sort of early modern. We have things like printing presses, for instance, and so very late medieval, early modern, roughly 15 or 1600s, perhaps, but with magic. And this is actually the beginning, so without too much context. In a beer-stained tavern, on a darkening winter afternoon, apprentice magician Talisman Morning stared into his pewter mug and hid in shadows and from his fellow mages. He was good at hiding, that was the problem. Part of it, anyway. A bumble of large bodies jolted past, laughing, slapping each other's shoulders. the off-duty King's Guard made of leather and muscle, and the comfort of the lack of any serious war in Everine in the last few decades. Chalice smiled a little, leaned further into his corner, drank some terrible but strong ale. The school wasn't precisely part of the kingdom. The magicians remained uneasily independent in the sense of everyone else's unease, but it did sit just up the hill, along Sorcerer's Road, from the sprawling, expanding central aisle of the Kingdom of Everine, and the school sat there in gleaming white marble splendor of reflecting sun. It announced in no uncertain terms that invasions, conflicts, disruptions to its serenity could and would be dealt with. Disruptions, yes. Chalice turned his mug around in his hands. The table was sticky, though he'd avoided putting his sleeve in the worst spots. Lucky that. Luck. That would be the problem. He finished most of the ale, and then winced. It had been his third. He should go back. He knew he should. He should let the sorceress and the other magicians tell him about what he could do, why he was so useful, how to best practice his gifts. He should be grateful for the home. He'd not had one before. He should learn how to help others, how to be heroic. Fellow magicians, kings, farmers, the kingdom. He should walk away and hide in the forest for good, because he'd never been able to help anyone, no one other than himself. And he was very sure at the moment that he'd never be able to. He finished the rest of the ale. If he did walk out of the city, into the woods, he'd be fine. He definitely wouldn't starve or freeze. But the land around him, the foxes, the birds, the trees and berries, or anyone out for a pleasure hunt, or anyone who came looking for him, which they would, because Talus was dangerous and could not be left alone. This tavern wasn't large. It was an older one, and he'd chosen it deliberately, tucked back near the King's Guard barracks and the training grounds, unassuming and solid, full of people who could likely handle themselves if something went wrong. It was growing more noisy, as a few more guards and palace staff arrived and met friends and bought rounds for each other. A tall man with tied-back blonde hair, wearing dusty riding leathers and a serious expression, came in. Someone else called over, "Jerry, you're late. Did the king make you stay and sing for him again?" and waved him over. The man laughed. It lit up his face, and retorted, "Absolutely, the entire Night Queen opera cycle. If you're good, I'll do it again for you," and joined them. Friends, Talus thought. It must be nice. He wondered briefly what the tall, attractive guardsman had been doing for the king. King Ametrine de Berry had a reputation for enjoying pleasures, but they generally were pleasurable for everyone involved. The present ruler of Everine might be self-indulgent, overly fond of jeweled robes and candied snowdrops, but he was also affable, cheerful, generous, which was immensely better than some previous monarchs, and therefore the general feeling was on the whole one of approval. The tall, pretty, but too serious guardsman, apparently named Jer, had come in wearing traveling clothes, though, more like someone who'd been out riding, not lounging in a king's bed. Not that it mattered, not that it should matter. Talus did not know him, because Talus, at least in theory, was running away and escaping to a doomed and lonely existence by himself in the woods, where he'd live on unseasonal, fortunate fruit and probably accidentally maim at least 2 unsuspecting people. He really should go back up the hill. If nothing else, the sorceress would be able to put up new shields around him. She was strong enough for that. He set his empty mug down. He considered the door, all the way across the tavern, and sighed. By the time he'd made it halfway across the room, he'd avoided 2 spilled drinks and 1 incredibly tipsy person stumbling into his path. Because he'd moved at, luckily, exactly the right time, the drinks splashed onto various bodies behind him and to his left. The extremely tipsy person fell right past him and into the young woman holding a meat pie, which flew out of her hand and into the knot of off-duty guards. Commotion commenced. Talus sighed again. At least nobody holding a knife or any sharp cutlery, and generally picked his way between low chairs, tables, hazards he tried not to provoke. He ducked behind an upturned bench at just the right time and got out the door while nobody was looking his way. He managed not to cause any more chaos, at least none directly his fault. as far as he could tell. When he made it outside, the sun had mostly gone down over clustered buildings, golden shop windows, narrow streets, ragged palace walls, setting light-streaked color like a painter's fantasy of the sky, pumpkin orange, cinnamon rose, vivid fuchsia, deep-sea blue. The city, on the verge of tiptoeing out of winter, might have been a fairy story, an old tale of wild magic, layers upon layers of history and stories. Behind it, the arches and walls of the school, up on the hill, stood like a beacon of white light, or reproaching him. Tallis sighed. It'd be a walk, but he could manage. He took a step toward the small street to start the walk back up. But then he stepped back, an impulse, the universe's hand on his shoulder. A cart lurched past, startled on its way to a delivery. A very large, very heavy barrel of beer jolted from the back. It hurled right past the spot where Tallis, not large, would have been. He collided with something behind him, something tall and person-shaped. Tallis, genuinely surprised, he did not, as a rule, run into things or people, turned around, discovered himself looking at, and being looked at by, the attractive guardsman. That gaze evaluated him as if memorizing details: shortness, brown eyes, curly auburn hair, a loose shirt, and comfortable trousers that did fit, but had been second-hand, from the random assortment of odds and ends the school had collected over the years. Tallis had arrived with nothing, at least nothing legitimately his. Chair said, "You're a magician." He said it without critique, though someone else might have. He also said it without doubt, a deep, chocolate-hued certainty. He did have a lovely voice, Tallis observed. Probably could have sung for the king, if requested. Lovely or not, the man had snuck up on him and clearly wanted something. Tallis, annoyed, snapped, "I'm an apprentice, not a very good one, and no, I won't charm your sweetheart into not being angry with you, or enchant your spear so you win the next pointless guardsman throwing contest, or whatever it is. I don't even know how to do that." Jer's eyebrows went up, curious. He was younger than Tallis had originally thought, especially when surprised. "Could you, if you did know how? I didn't think magicians did." "Well, no, maybe. We're not supposed to. I couldn't anyway. If that's all, I really should be getting back." He should be. "I need your help," Jer said. "I already said no." "Think I've started this off wrong." Jer ran a hand through his hair. The blonde tumbled loose in waves. He might have been a storybook illustration, a walking recruitment poster, an inducement to join the ranks of the Kingsguard just to get closer to those shoulders. "My name's Jaron de Michaud, one of the scouts from the Royal Guard." "Yes," Tallis agreed. "That would be why you're wearing the king's insignia." Jer blinked at him. "Yes? The king's going boating on the river in 3 days. Oh, how nice for him." "Are all magicians this unhelpful? I've never met one before." "No, I told you I'm not a very good one." "But I think you are," Jer said. "I saw you in there just now. Was it some sort of mischief spell? Seeing what you could do? Spilling beer? Getting Teague to trip over just then? Sneaking out from the school to play around?" "No, no, and absolutely not. And who's Teague? You saw him, you made him trip into Jade's venison pie." "I did not." Jaron opened his mouth, looked at Tallis. The ebbing sundown, the emerging gold from window lamplight, outlined his cheekbone, his jawline, the faint hint of blonde stubble because he hadn't shaved. He said, "You do mean that? You didn't do it on purpose?" "I didn't," Tallis said, and then took in that statement. "You believe me?" "Shouldn't I?" Jer said, and then muttered, half under his breath, "Also, I could win a throwing contest without any magical help, just so you know," in the tone of someone embarrassed about it, but wanting to be clear that he did not in fact need any magical assistance. He said, "It's not something I can control, and I won't be much help." "But it's something," Jer said. "You can do magic. You're down here. You're outside the school. And if I'm right, I'm going to need someone's help. If you're right about what? I think, Sharon said, 3 days from now, on the royal barge, someone's going to try to kill the king. And we'll pause there, because that's the end of chapter 1.
Okay. Can you hear me? We good? Okay, cool. I had to change headphones because it started like thundering outside. So I thought maybe this would be like more quiet, less likely to pick up the thunder. Anyway. So I'm gonna read, I'm E.H. Lupton. You can call me M if you want. I'm going to read from the, I don't know, the 5th chapter, something of my forthcoming novel, Troth. There's the cover. Yay. It's the 3rd book in the Wisconsin Gothic series, which follows Ulysses, who starts out as a grad student and eventually becomes a professor, and Sam, who's a librarian, who might have a god stuck in his head, through a slightly more magical version of the late 1960s. In Troth, they finally moved in together. Unfortunately, the new apartment is not quite the safe haven they'd hoped for. Their neighbors have a ghost problem. The building is infested with spiders. To make matters more complicated, Ulysses's brother Laz is back from Vietnam, and he's not happy about Sam's presence in Ulysses's life. But Laz's anger isn't their only challenge. When their magical bond starts acting up, Ulysses's increasing discomfort and attempts to fix it drive a wedge between him and Sam just when it becomes apparent that the spiders are no accident and a shadowy cult may mean them harm. So to carry on the theme, in this scene, Ulysses tries to stop a bar fight, and then he and Laz protect Sam from a shadowy attacker. Okay. Sorry. The problem was that every time Ulysses got everyone calmed down, Laz went and opened his mouth again. The guys weren't even angry at him per se. They were young and scared and on their way to the draft board pretty soon. If only Laz would stop goading them, Ulysses could buy a round of beers and everything would be fine. I just don't think you have the balls for it, Laz said, and the biggest and drunkest of the guys grabbed a bottle off the bar. It was an empty bottle, so when he turned it upside down, no one got beer on their shoes, and the fact that Ulysses was clutching at that probably indicated how badly things were going. The guy was easily Sam's height and 250 pounds. He looked like he worked construction when he wasn't harassing hapless ex-Air Force captains in bars. Not, in other words, the kind of person Ulysses would have chosen to pick a fight with. I'm not going to stand here and be insulted by some fascist, the guy growled, and that stung. Ulysses bit back an angry reaction. You're free to leave, Laz drawled. The area immediately around them seemed to be holding its breath. Ulysses wished desperately for a bouncer, and then the bartender dropped a glass, which shattered. Laz startled badly, head whipping around, and then he bent forward with a broken noise of pain, clutching his temples. Everyone stared at him, Ulysses with concern, one hand hovering uselessly an inch above Laz's back, the rest with something between suspicion and pity. Laz straightened up an instant later, eyes wild and searching for Ulysses. We have to go, he said. The huge guy took his moment and swung the bottle like a baseball bat. In a move that could only have been guided by foresight, Laz snaked a hand up and hit the inside of the man's forearm hard. The man yelped in pain or surprise, and 2 seconds later, Laz was holding the bottle while the man staggered back, hand clutched to his chest. Laz raised the captured bottle like he was about to break it over the guy's head. His erstwhile attacker flinched. Be careful, Laz said, arresting his momentum just above the man's head. You could hurt someone. He spun the bottle, set it gently down on the bar, and took off at a dead run. It was a warm night, and the door to the bar had been propped open. Laz didn't break stride as he exited and took off down the street. When Ulysses made it out, he looked down the line of streetlights to see Laz sprinting after a man in a dark suit, who was himself running after Sam. Ulysses ran, gasping, after them. Sam was usually pretty fast, but he kept checking behind him, which tugged him off course and slowed him down. He was glancing over his shoulder as he reached the intersection with East Wash and stepped into the streets without looking. Ulysses winced hard, heart racing at the squeal as a driver slammed on their brakes. Sam danced away from the car, somehow unhurt. Even from far up the street, Ulysses could hear the driver curse. Sam took a shuffling half step farther from the hood, raising both hands in a mea culpa gesture, and then started running again. The delay had allowed the man in the suit to close the gap, and halfway down the next block, he stretched out his hand to catch Sam's arm. Ulysses tried to draw a breath to shout a warning, couldn't. But then Laz was there, coiling himself to leap. An instant later, the man was on the ground, grappling with Laz. Ulysses looked at the two of them, grabbed Sam's hand, and pulled. "We can't just leave him," Sam hissed. "He can handle himself." But even as Ulysses got Sam moving, the stranger was throwing Laz off him and jumped back to his feet. He looked wildly at the two of them. Ulysses stepped between him and Sam, pulling the little butterfly knife out of his pocket, and the man retreated a pace. A large, dark car rolled up, and he dashed into the street and jumped into the passenger side. Seconds later, it took off in a squeal of rubber. And that's 5 minutes. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello. I'm Heather O'Malley. I write books with Bold Stroke Books, so I can be found on their website. I'm reading from Hands of the Morai, which is a fantasy adventure novel about a trans person working to become a paladin. And sadly, to keep on the theme, there is some drinking involved. The old woman stepped forward with another chalice, one that smelled warm, of different herbs and honeycomb. There was another scent as well underneath, but he could not figure it out. It made him think of freedom and movement. She placed the chalice against his lips. Drink and be found. Once the chalice was empty, his head fuzzed more. He grew dizzier. The world vibrated at the corner of his eyes. Sounds began to slur together, and words became clearer but less differentiated from music. When the coals brightened again, fire and earth breathing right before him, he stood spellbound, breath matching the pulse of the coals, teetering, wobbling, and he ultimately tumbled forward into the light. When he was no longer drowning in pure sensation, a faint sound grew in strength. Hammer ringing on steel, pulling his attention. As he rubbed the distortion from his eyes, the first thing he focused on was the large woman standing by a huge forge, looking very much like her sculpture. A scarred and scorched leather apron was over her clothes, and her boots had burn marks along the shank. Sweat covered her dark skin, plastering her hair to her head. Muscles moved as she hammered a rhythm into a billet of steel. She held by tongs, red hot on the anvil, sparks and flakes of impurities flying. After a few more hits, the billet went back into the coke to reheat. The Morai turned, dark eyes with traces of forge glow in them traced over his body. He could feel the weight of her gaze upon his skin and knew she was seeing more than mortal eyes ever could. She finished up and nodded. "Good, you're here." Not having a clue what to say to an actual goddess, he stood there and nodded, then noticed his body did not look as it had before. It was now somewhat diffuse. Before he could put more attention towards that, the Morai turned and worked the bellows with one hand, turning the billet in the coke with tongs held in the other hand. "Come over here and pick up a hammer." He complied, holding the forge hammer awkwardly. The shoe hammer was something he was far more familiar with, yet that seemed similar to this particular forging hammer. There were others about the room, but this was the one that sat most naturally. When she turned back to him, the Morai glanced down and corrected his hand placement. She smiled at him and took up the tongs. The billet was again a bright cherry red. Placing the billet on the anvil, the Morai ordered, "I'll tap a rhythm. You follow with your hammer on the steel." She began with a tap, tap, strike, tap, tap, strike. The work was odd, and he lost himself in the simple rhythm of it, as the billet lengthened and thinned, folded back onto itself as there were repeated cycles of heating the metal and working it. Little flakes of impurities came free, knocked off with the rhythm. With careful supervision, he drew the steel, scattering ash over the heated metal and folding it carefully over. The pattern of hammering drew him in, and time stretched. His body grew more solid, more present, less diffuse. After an unknown period of time, the Morai called a halt and scrutinized the billet before setting it to the side. "Nicely done, Ash." She looked the now named Ash over. The examination was unnerving, as he could almost feel the weight of the Morai's gaze on him as an actual physical presence. His body felt weird, almost in flux, though that was settling down. The Morai looked after the scan. "Good, yes, good. Your truth is being revealed, and imperfections are being worked free, and will continue to work themselves out. Lost sisters have such good steel at their core, though it requires a delicate hand to forge properly. To be forged of such steel is a gift. However, there is always a cost." The Morai lifted the drawn-out steel billet they had been working on, inspecting the metal for any serious flaws. "Your childhood, your missing girlhood, is the cost of your steel, as time lost can never be regained. You may feel those parts of you, those experiences, that do not match your steel are a deep loss, but it is up to you to determine if it is a fair price for being found. Those lost moments can build up your strength or turn into pockets of fragility, causing your steel to fail. To be forged into your easy, nor is it meant to be. To shape steel takes knowledge, patience, skill, and good materials. If the core material is wrong, it breaks. If it's not refined properly, it breaks. Draw out the blade, it breaks. If you do not anneal it, the steel becomes strong but brittle. If you do not work the steel, fold it, you cannot work out the imperfections. If you work it too much, you can ruin the steel and it will not take proper shape. If you temper it wrong, it twists and breaks. Your steel is good, strong even at its core, so we can work together to shape you to your best, to make the most of your steel. Events do not always play out that way, but if you stick to the process, we shall see what kind of steel you are made of. That is, if you want to go through with the work." She placed the steel billet back into the fire, using the bellows to heat the blade again back to a cherry red. The Morai looked over at her. "Shall we?" Ash picked up the hammer, hefting its weight more comfortably with her now solid form, and joined the Morai at the anvil. Time to get to work. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm next. So I'm just gonna just start introducing myself. I'm E.M. Anderson. I am the author of The Remarkable Retirement of Edna Fisher. Let's see if I can, there we go. If I block my face, you can see the cover. So that came out with a small press last year. And it's about an 83-year-old who leaves the nursing home for fantastical adventure when she learns she's the chosen one. That is actually not what I'm reading from today. I have a book coming out in March of 2025, on March 25th, from Mira Books, called The Keeper of Lonely Spirits. I sadly cannot show you the cover yet, even though I've seen it and it's great. So that is a cozy fantasy about an old man cursed with immortality who hunts ghosts rather than making mortal friends because they'll just die on him one day. Most of the story takes place in a fictional town in Northwest Ohio, but I am going to read from the first chapter today, which takes place in Savannah, Georgia, so just don't let that throw you off. And this reading should be just about like exactly 5 minutes, so hopefully I will not go over too much, but we do have a little extra time just in case. A spirit was lurking in the stairwell of the historic steps on Savannah's waterfront. For months, the steps had been even more treacherous than usual. Not only tourists, but folks who had lived in Savannah all their lives had slipped going up or down, skinned knees, scraped hands, laughed nervously, and said they must have missed a stair or misjudged the height. A few accused friends of pushing them, but said friends vehemently denied it, accusing the accusers of clumsiness in turn. At last, the tourist had broken a leg and threatened to sue the city. Never mind the signs at either end, warning users the steps were historical and therefore not up to code. The signs probably would have prevented the success of such a lawsuit, but the city, tired of complaints, hung caution tape across the stairwell and closure signs for good measure and turned their attention to other things. Unbeknownst to them, the unassuming old white man standing before the steps in the wee hours of a mild April morning hoped to solve their problem before the sun rose. He didn't look like a ghost hunter. He was tall and thin, with blue eyes, a hawkish nose, and thin lips that rarely smiled. Just now, a messenger bag was slung over his shoulder. Dressed in flannel, jeans, and work boots, he looked like a farmer, which he wasn't, but had been in his boyhood some 2 centuries ago. Now he was a groundskeeper, at Colonial Park Cemetery for the present, but not for much longer if all went well this morning. He thumbed up the brim of his flat cap, contemplating the stairwell and the spirit therein. No corporeal form, but a haze of color and smell and emotion, a rotted greenish-brown that smelled like Georgia's coastal salt marshes, but more. The whole stairwell was mucky with fear. Windows rattled in the buildings on either side. The groundskeeper glanced down the street, saw no one, lifted the caution tape, and stepped under it. A cloud of fear enveloped him. Rot oozed on his tongue, a phantom feeling of sludge. When he'd been young and freshly cursed, the spirit's swell of emotion had overwhelmed him. He'd drowned in it, unable to separate the feelings of the dead from his own. They'd scared him, the feelings, the voices, not that they were precisely voices. For decades, he'd avoided them when he could, ignored them when he couldn't. Even Jack had never known about them. These days, the dead comforted him, company he didn't fear losing and never got to know too well, the closest to death he ever came. A reason for him to live, if there were a reason when life had been too long already. Of course there was the curse, but the curse wasn't a reason to live so much as the thing keeping him alive. The windows rattled harder. The rusting metal handrail in the center of the steps groaned. The groundskeeper sucked in his cheeks, hoping he at last had good information. He'd spotted the spirit right off, soon as he'd visited the east end of River Street, but he'd had a devilish time finding anything out about it. When his usual hunt through libraries and newspapers failed him, he'd resorted to riding around with tourists on 3 of Savannah's many ghost tours. The last had set him on the right track after 2 hours on a cramped trolley beside an Ohio teen who never once let up complaining. This ghost tour was nothing, the teen had said. He'd spent loads of time in the cemetery back home, and it was way scarier. He'd seen ghosts at home. He'd thought they were going to see one on this tour, too, and didn't their guide have any better ghost stories? The groundskeeper, of course, had actually seen several spirits on the tour, but in the absence of anyone under age 12, he was the only one. As the trolley bumped over the cobbles, tilting alarmingly on the steep ramp down to River Street, the tourists saw the still water, the 3-story riverboat Georgia Queen docked alongside the quay, the dark windows of the 19th century storefronts lining the near side of the street. The groundskeeper saw the dead. Most ghost tours, most ghost stories, were largely hogwash, but they often contained nuggets of truth. In this case, the guide had told the tragic tale of 2 tween girls who had disappeared less than a year ago. The police had barely bothered looking for them. The disappearance had never been solved. Their ghosts had allegedly been spotted over a dozen times in the last 6 months, always on the waterfront. They'd ask strangers for help, only to vanish when people tried to take a closer look. Hogwash, partly. The spirit in the stairwell was a newer one, young and scared, so the groundskeeper had investigated any disappearances reported in Savannah in the past year. In a newspaper article dated 9 months back, he'd found a small paragraph mentioning the disappearance of 2 tween girls and instructing anyone with information to go to the police. Less than a week later, one girl had been found, traumatized but alive, at which point all information about the incident had dried up. The other girl, the groundskeeper reckoned, had never been found and was likely dead. What there were of the spirit's memories fit such a story. It remembered neither life nor death, only the confused terror of its last moments. The clearest glimpse the groundskeeper had gotten was the frightened face of a girl, the one who'd been found. This, then, might well be the girl who hadn't. He'd returned to the waterfront this morning to find out, to send her on, if he could, into whatever awaited in the hereafter, before she did something worse than break a tourist's leg. Layla Brown, he said. The spirit twisted toward him. He let out a soft breath. Finally, the right name. A name alone often wasn't enough to calm a spirit, but names had power, his mam had always said. This spirit's name had been buried nearly as deep as his own. Peter Shaughnessy, a name no one now living knew, and the last connection he had, aside from an old pocket watch, to his family and the place he'd been born and raised and cursed. The end. Not the end of the chapter, but the end of me reading.
Okay. These have all been great. So I'm going next. As I said when I did the introduction, my name's Monique. I write mostly short science fiction, or at least that is what I have had published. But what I'm going to be reading from today is an unpublished story, just the beginning of it, and you are not going to believe the setting in which the story begins. I do not know how this happened, and we did not plan this in any way whatsoever. So I will begin. No going back. Walking into Fiza's from the brightness of the concourse, I paused for shapes to resolve out of the bar's dim interior. It's small and square with a low ceiling and used to be a storage area. Titan Station wasn't originally designed for this, bars and shops and so many people. It was a research outpost lazily orbiting Titan until the true value of the moon's resources was realized. Then they began to carve out space for shops and bars and quarters for the workers who would be needed, eventually cobbling on additions. You're early, Kate, client, Fiza asks, eyebrows rising as if surprised someone would hire me. Which is fair. Jobs come in fits and starts, and it's been a while since the last one. We'll see. I lean against the bar. I'll have the Pilsner. She nods as if it isn't what I order every day, and I watch her practiced movements as she grabs a glass. It's a weird comfort. The email I had received was short on details, but the services I offer are equally vague. I look for what people want to hide from partners, employers, from themselves. On your tab, Fiza asks. She knows the answer, but it's her way of reminding me how much I owe. Yeah, I say, and take my beer to a table close to the entrance. As I wait, I mentally calculate how much I need to make from this case. Fiza's patience is not infinite, and I want to return to the surface. That is more out of reach. It's not as if living on the surface of Titan is some miraculous improvement over the space station, but it would be somewhere else, not here. A shadow falls across the table and I look up. My first thought is she's tall. The second is she has a lot of money. Fashionably dressed with the jumpsuit tight in the legs and loose on the torso, the makeup on her face and arms highly detailed, overlapping swirls of green and blue. I dress as I want, but I can't help be aware of the stark contrast to my shaved head and loose dark clothes. Mom used to say men wouldn't pay attention to a girl who didn't make an effort, but that had the opposite effect than the one she undoubtedly intended. Kate, she says. I nod. I'm Boa. Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice. Her voice is delicate, soft. Anything for a client, I say with a wink, overcompensating. What can I do for you? She taps painted nails on the table, red with explosions of yellow scattered across them. Someone has stolen my bioprint, she says. I press my lips in a straight line, suppressing the alternately sarcastic and rude responses bubbling to the surface of my mind. Bioprints are clean genetic blueprints. Without bioengineered alterations, we couldn't live long-term on this station or on the surface or a lot of other places. Some of the changes just make life a little more pleasant, like slight adjustments to visual and auditory ranges, while others are more fundamental, like the ones that protect against the excess levels of radiation we are subject to without a protective atmosphere. Cumulatively, these changes also make a return to Earth all but impossible, never mind the cost involved in traveling halfway across the solar system. We know we are no longer built for that, but a clean, alteration-free bioprint holds within it the possibility of return. The alterations are also inheritable, but irreversible once they are. For people like me, there is no going back. Not that I agreed to any of this, and not that my mom fully understand when she chose to have a child here, which is a whole other ethical kettle of fish. What do you want from me, I ask, arms folded across my chest like a shield. I'm being blackmailed for its return, Boa says. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry to hear that, which sounds like the right thing to say. I work in the chief administrator's office, she continues. I'm being asked for classified documents. And, I interrupt, as much as I need the money, this is both out of my league and something I don't want to be involved in. People like Boa, who have money and bioprints and options, see people like me without formal work assignments or the ability to leave the immediate environs as means to their ends. Surely there is someone in the administration security office you can go to, or some investigator who helps people like you. Boa gives a quivering smile. I'm sure it often works. She's very attractive, even if not at all my type. If I report this, they will consider me a liability. I'll lose my job and I can't afford that. I'm supporting my mother back on Earth. Whatever her version of can't afford is, I know it is very different than mine. I don't care about her or her mother or her job in the fucking chief administrator's office. I'm on the verge of giving her a very firm no when she continues. I can pay well, she says, very well, whatever it takes. And she names a daily rate that takes my breath away. I have doubts as to how far I will get, and I don't much care about Boa's problems, but if she's willing to pay that much, I'm willing to fuck around and see. I'm all but certain at least part of what she's told me is a lie, and I hope it isn't about the money. What more can you tell me? I ask with my best attempt at a smile. That's it. So.
Yay.
Thank you
Oh,
all.
that's why I was hearing a weird chiming and it was my timer.
Oh.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes. Can I do a quick plug for my website since I'm
Yes.
sponsored?
Please do.
Rainbow Space Magic 5.0 is sponsored by Contents May Vary, a geeky website where I cover geeky things. I also have a podcast also named Contents May Vary, where I interview geeky people also about geeky things. I haven't updated in a while just because of the heat, but I interview authors, actors, directors, pretty much anything that is of interest. Check it out at angiefsutton.com.
Thank you, Angie. And thank you all. I really enjoyed listening to everybody's stories today. That was wonderful. And we couldn't have organized that better as far as thematically if we had tried. So thank you all. The keynote is coming up in 34 minutes. And after that, at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, we're going to do a Hangout and Zoom meeting if anybody wants to hang around and chat. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you all.
Awesome.
All right. Bye.